Okay, welcome everyone to the Wood Egg File of 1771 section. So I should begin by giving a hearty congratulations to Sarol Edin and the organizers. Sarol Edin and won the Info Children Eagle of November Bullets. Many warm greetings to all of you, conference participants from near and far who have an interest in Mongolian history and culture. Paul öğretti olsun en kontrolün doğrusu bir monitör provider so you one of that stop in the change that bring mental there. So this session is dedicated to the 250th anniversary of the Russian exodus of the Torgut people under the leadership of Oshahan. En modagin salpor ordanika Oshani with the Tolkien or Torgut the Artun or Sasa Dubisin Hoytum Town giving the The session is intended to mark this important anniversary with a scholarly discussion of the social, political, and cultural circumstances that led to the Exodus, but also to memorialize the many thousands of people who perished or otherwise failed to reach their destination. Çoğunlar en çok örgü topluluğun dürbün karşı bölgesinin meydan oluştu söyleyin nöksel derlin talar yazım şimdi yani elçilik orul testi kadın en üretsin bon versiyon adrafı çadar ve olmayan kumusin dorsklin kundukları doruklayın. In that sense, this session is organized with a sense of solemnity and sadness, but also pride in the spirit that allowed the many thousands of Bollywood people to survive the arduous trip and thrive as a community to this very day. Tifchutqara enutaki urtanika untkul hansu unigin alinike türü sunche olmayan Bollywood'da en bunda hepsi zamika down towards teknik itkıl düşünün için Arap onlara önerdirilen kurtul çeşitli hükçü bağımsızlığı olsun deniliyor. Their ability to preserve their culture and honor their history has persisted to this day. Teknik söylediği haklıca tuhen değerli çapır önemli kurtul haklı ülkece. But given the complex cultural policies being carried out today in the Zunghad homeland, what a dangerous and difficult trek of more than 2,000 miles could not do, government cultural policy may succeed in destroying the Torgut identity in Zunghad. Givica, Zuka Zunghadin the be soiling fox for Lake Alshuzul, Hoyt and Kari Berin Zamika. Toolge jammer ayolta hunde so aylın iyice çadak bir versin bol. Zaskin gazetelerin söylediğin bodulun Zunghad'da Torgut övülmek isterliği ustkıcıçı mahadbayı. So that's my introduction, and we're going to have a change in the program. The first speaker, Dr. Kitinov cannot make it. We weren't able to make a connection through Zoom. So we're going to move his talk to the end, and I'll read his paper. So we'll begin with the first speaker. Yeah. Kitinov bakşı, o da yetiştikleri sırasında da bir de programa cevabını soruyorsun içine. O da ankeni o da yine John Perkins, and let me just say a few words about John's biography. John is an author and filmmaker whose work focuses on the natural world. He's currently making a film series, The Infinite Earth, about the spiritual life of various groups of indigenous people, one of whom is the Kalmyks. His works include the prize-winning film Frankie and Albert, a drama that takes place in the slums of Sao Paulo. The book To the End of the Earth, the Pantheon, 1981, with the American Museum of Natural History. This lasts about 4 great early scientific expeditions, including the famed third Central Asiatic expedition led by R.C. Andrews, spurred Perkins' lifelong interest in the Mongol world. John Perkins will evaluate the world betekent behalçı kinolarlık şil kırız o da fiyatlar bir devki onun hangi kino hizmere böyle tekniğin hangi diyeyim. Tuni bu devlet Sao Paulo'nun yavrusunda horoldu önünde Frankie ve Albert Matken'e sanatlı kino. Perkins nasıl tursta Mongol Chutin gördüğü sonuçta Türk Bodnya. Okay, John. Yes, and the title is Oshikan. What prompted Oshikan to lead the Kalmyks out of Russia? Yeah,
Exactly.
okay.
Thomas, thank you so much for that introduction. Very flattering. I'm also delighted to hear for the first time in my life the words Frankie and Albert, a film I made, the title for a film I made, pronounced in Mongolian. And contrary to appearance, I myself am not Mongolian. I don't know, I know exactly 2 words in Mongolian. You will hear me utter them at the end of my talk today. I'm going to give a general account of the situation of the Kalmyks in Kalmykia that led up to the Kalmyk, what I call the Kalmyk return. It was the Turgut flight back to China that happened in 1771. So, why in the year 1771 did a group of Central Asian nomads, by some counts totaling several hundred thousands of men, women, and children, and millions of animals, abruptly and in secret leave their Volga homeland and march east almost 2,000 miles across barren steppes in the dead of winter to get to a land which none of them had ever seen before? This is the story of a people trying to cling to a way of life, even as the possibility of living that life slipped away from them. It's a complicated story, but what we have here in essence is the age-old conflict between settled people and nomads, between Jacob and Esau, Lapith and Centaur, desert and Selma, heath and grange, or as it's styled in America, cowboy and Indian. Today, we're talking about the conflict between the nomad Kalmyks on the one hand and the settled Russians and Chinese on the other. Quickly, let's look at the map here. These, in this beautiful turquoise color, are the Eurasian steppes. Zungaria, if that's the way it's understood to be pronounced, is this area in here. Here's the Tian Shan, here is the Altai. The Gobi Desert and Mongolia are here. There's Lake Baikal. This is the Caspian and the Black Sea. And this is the Pontic steppe here, where this little line is the Volga. And the Kalmyks essentially made a flight like that across the northern part of the steppes. All right. When the Mongol dynasty collapsed in 1368, the Mongols were pushed back again above the Great Wall. The Mongol tribes who would later become the Kalmyks established themselves in the western part of Mongolia in what was then called Zungaria, and is now the northern half of China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. I'm mangling the pronunciation of these place names in Mongolian, so anyone can shout out a correction if you want to. Like all nomads, these proto-Kalmyks occupied deserted open land, that fully half of the Earth's surface that settled people never know. Few of them had ever seen a road, a fence, or a house. They moved constantly in search of pastures. They lived in tents and had few possessions. and since whatever they did possess, they had to carry as they moved. Their territories were open grasslands, mostly high altitude, interspersed with soaring mountains and stony deserts. That's a Mongolian encampment on the northern part of the Gobi 100 years ago. By the end of the 1500s, we find the Western Mongol tribes fighting amongst themselves for hegemony of the Zungarian steppe. A certain Ko-Orlik, now how do we really pronounce his name? Thank you. Was the chief of one of the contending tribes. The history of the Kalmyk Khans, as it's known in English, which is an anonymous Mongolian language chronicle written about 1800, is our most reliable primary source, and tells us that, and I quote, Ko-Orlik thought to himself that rather than destroying his own subjects by killing one another, it would be better to go to a distant land and dwell near people of foreign extraction and to war with them and take booty, or loot, as the case may be. Accordingly, in the Earth Dragon year, which in our count is 1628, he brought 50,000 households of his own subjects, composed of 4 allied tribes and accompanied by his 6 sons, moved westward. These breakaway tribes together referred to themselves as people moving away. Their Turkic neighbors called them Kalmyks, meaning the overflow or the spill, and in time Kalmyk became the name by which the world knew them. It was a decades-long migration, passing through Siberia to avoid clashes with their Kazakh and Kyrgyz rivals. So let's just look quickly and see. Kyrgyzstan is this part here. So they went from Zungaria along the northern edge there and eventually ended up down in the so-called Volga Delta, or Caspian Steppe. Oh, that was what I needed, but I didn't get it. Let's see. So it was a decades-long migration, passing through Siberia to avoid clashes with the Kazakh and Kyrgyz rivals who occupied the steppes further north. The Russians eyed the Kalmyk advance warily, but in those days, the Russians' hold on Siberia was tenuous, and they found themselves powerless to stop the Kalmyks. Once one of the Russian governors in Siberia reported that the migrating Kalmyks, quote, neither sent any ambassadors to us nor paid any tribute. They told us, we are not settled people, we're nomads. We roam where we want. Arriving in the Volga's immense delta, the Kalmyks found that, I'm again quoting from the history, on both the east and west sides of this river mouth, apart from a number of Tartars who were powerless to inflict harm on them, the area was not inhabited. Now, when I say Tartar here, it means the Turkic peoples on the steppe west of Mongolia. It's a general term. It has many meanings. Most of these people that the Kalmyks dealt with were Sunni Muslims at that point. So imagine for a moment. Let's see if I have to picture you out. There are the steppe lands in Zungaria that they left. And I could, but I won't try on this computer I'm not familiar with to show you, but there are actually some jurors here and over here that you can see, but there are no roads there. That's pretty much how it's been since the Kalmyks left it in the early 1600s. So imagine for a moment rolling grassland, wide rivers lined by dense stands of trees, swans, sturgeons, wolves, wild horses. This is the lowland steppe of Tolstoy and Lermontov. That's a schematic picture of the Pontic steppe there. The Caspian's the big body of water on the right, and that line going down to the top of it is the Volga Delta. And they occupy that whole area. Now this is the Volga steppe here. There's the river in the background. These are stands of trees in the river basin. The rest of it is all grassland. And it's lowland steppe and extremely rich to this day. There's there again quickly is the Volga working its way up there. Here's the Don, and here's the Ural, and they occupied this whole area there. There's the Caspian there. All right. Man. So that's why I say swans and sturgeons and wolves and wild horses. These would be the typical fauna of this wonderful part of the world. Russian towns there, the history continues, were small. In that place, the fresh grass and last year's grass were plentiful on the steppe. All the areas from Astrakhan to Samara, Astrakhan's there, there's Saratov, Samara's up there, there's Kazan. This is where Stalingrad, or now called Volgograd, or Taritsyn was the old name, is located. It's where the Don and the Volga must meet, just so you know. So all the area from Astrakhan to Samara, from the Ural River up to the Volga, was made the permanent homeland of Ko-Orlik's subjects. Although this was the territory of the White Khan, which was their name for the Russian Tsar, Ko-Orlik neither informed them that he had taken possession of the territory, nor had he any intention of doing so. The Russia into which the Kalmyks had ventured was in those years just emerging from their so-called time of troubles, which in the early 1600s had devastated the country. There was the year without a summer in 1601, a worldwide cataclysm caused by the clouds of ash thrown into the atmosphere by the eruption of the volcano Huayna Putina in Peru, which caused famine that in Russia is said to have claimed the lives of a quarter of the inhabitants. There was also the armed uprisings that led to the overthrow of the Ruriks and the installation of the Romanovs as czars, as well as invasions by both the Polish-Lithuanian Federation and the Swedes. But in those years, worse than all this, were the incessant raids into Russian territory by the Tartar Khanates to the south. Every major Russian city except Novgorod and thousands of smaller settlements were sacked in those years. Moscow was burnt twice. Each year the Tartars drove tens of thousands of captive Russians, Ukrainians and Poles down to the Black Sea and sold them into slavery. Interestingly enough, a lot of them ended up as galley slaves in Venetian ships that were opposing the Ottomans, but that's commerce at work, I guess, selling in this case the galley slaves. That's the west bank of the Volga, the higher bank. That's the delta itself, which is a vast sea of reeds even to this day. And this is a Kalmyk settlement in the delta. And those yurts, as opposed to the one that I showed you before, which was a Mongolian felt yurt, these have at least walls of reed. I suppose the roofs are still felt. The Kalmyks, meanwhile, shared an ancient enmity with these same Tartar groups, who had always been their chief rivals on the steppes. The fact that the Tartars were Muslim and the Kalmyks were in Ko-Orlik's time were just converting to Tibetan Buddhism only heightened their antipathy. In the warlike Kalmyks, the Russians saw a solution to the plight of the constant Tartar raids. The Kalmyks could serve as a buffer in the defense of Russia's southern borders, and perhaps even further the Russia's imperial ambitions as they expanded southward into the steppes and the Caucasus. Thus, both sides pursued a fragile truce, swearing shirts, or oaths of loyalty, the Russians on a cross, the Kalmyks by licking a knife and holding it to the throat. Let the Kalmyks not attack the Russian cities when a typical shirt. Let us not be allied with the Persian Emperor, the Turkish Sultan, the Azov Bey, or the Khan of the Crimean Tartars. This system functioned well enough over the next century, with the Kalmyks holding the Tartars at bay in the wild fields as the steppes separating the Slavic Christian north from the Turkic Muslim south were known. However, as time went on, the Russian state recovered and grew in strength and spread further south into the wild fields. Ko-Orlik, the first Kalmyk leader, was killed in 1644 in a disastrous campaign against the Caucasan tribes. and was succeeded by a son, a grandson, and then a great-grandson, Ayuki, who ruled for half a century from 1672 to 1723, and was considered the greatest of the Kalmyk leaders. And it is to this Ayuki Khan that the origins of the Kalmyk return can be traced. Oh, I didn't realize that was up. Now, this is a Russian village. It happens to be one in Siberia, but it's a riverside village, and it probably looked very much like the ones that were then just being constructed along the Don and the Volga and the Ural rivers in the territory of the Kalmyks. Let's see if we missed something. Oh, that's what it is. Okay. And then the next one. Aha. Okay. What happened, according to the history of the Kalmyk Khans, was that this is leading up to the flight of the Kalmyks themselves. In the Earth Tiger year, which was 1698, Ayuki sent his nephew to Tibet to bring back lamas, unquote. Doing so because after the Kalmyk conversion of Buddhism, Ayuki wanted to promote the new creed amongst them, as much as anything to counter encroachment by the Islam and Christianity of their Tatar and Russian neighbors. The history continues. On his way back from Tibet, Ayuki's nephew had an audience with the Chinese emperor, who detained him for 10 years, but eventually sent him back to the Kalmyks with the offer of the best Greek grasslands in Zungaria, together with great riches if Ayuki and the Kalmyks would return to the land of their ancestors and aid the Chinese in the conquest of the Western Mongols living there. Ayuki, however, rejected this proposal of treaty against his Mongol kinfolk in Zungaria, to whose Khan he had recently given his daughter in marriage. Thus, China's attempt to entice Ayuki and the Kalmyks to return was unsuccessful, but the seeds of the notion had been planted. Just before Ayuki died, bitter argument erupted over his succession, and at his death it turned to bloodshed. The following decades of internecine feuds, which the Kalmyks termed the years of the Great Disaster, were worsened by massive losses in their herds caused by Tatar raids and by Russia's accelerated appropriation of Kalmyk sovereign powers as it expanded southward into the steppes. Writes Professor Kardanovsky, one of the scholars who gave a talk this morning, I believe. Quote, creation of the so-called lines. Now, these are lines. It's an earthen fortification. I think that's in very far eastern Ukraine. They ran east to west across the steppe and kept the Tatar groups, ideally kept the Tatar groups from making incursions to the northward. The creation of so-called lines by the Russians, which were the earthwork fortifications, and the Russians' capture of Azov, the main seaport on the Crimea, from the Ottomans in 1736, gave an enormous impetus to colonization of the Don-Volga area and brought the Kalmyks into direct conflict with Russian settlers over grazing lands, fishing rights, and forced religious conversion. The period between 1741 and 1763, in that period, 200 villages were built from the lower Don region alone. The new residents turned the adjacent steppes into cultivated fields, depriving the Kalmyks of their pastures and growing economic enterprises such as the state-run vineyards and the silk factories of Toritsyn, and the exploitation of salt mines attracted numerous Russian and Ukrainian colonists. Significantly, these lines and colonization projects, contends the scholar Gunnar Kenderby, largely curtailed the Kalmyks' raiding opportunities, which in the past had always been their best chance of replenishing their economic fortune. And so, Kardanovsky concludes, throughout this period, despondent Kalmyks continually entertained the idea of leaving the Volga steppe. In the Kalmyks' dilemma, we see a mirror to the plight of the indigenous nomadic inhabitants of the American Great Plains, except that in the case of the Kalmyks, unlike the Native Americans, they had the option of leaving their territory for another place, or at least so they imagined. In 1741, after the Kalmyk succession had passed through several more khans, it fell to one of Ayuki's grandsons, who proved to be such a gifted leader that, says the history quoted in the Fire Ox year, which was 1757, Tsarina Elizabeth presented him with a golden sword and a jeweled belt. But then in the Iron Snake year, 1761, he died, leaving his son Ubashi, only 17, as supreme leader of the Kalmyks. A procession of Buddhists in early photographic times in Kalmykia. This is a painting by a man named Grant. It just shows his version of a typical cavalry skirmish between Kalmyks on the one side, and I believe the Cossacks, he considers them there on the other. Sometimes they were allied, sometimes they were fighting against each other. Things were very fluid on the frontier. Now this is a picture of in the wintertime of a Kalmyk caravan. I believe they're carrying cotton in those bales, but I use it as a suggestion of what it was like when they finally did make the flight, which we're about to get to. Okay, I'll quote the historian C.D. Barkman now, who continues the narrative of the build-up to the flight itself. Immediately after the elder Khan's death, all kinds of intrigues started, one of the principal authors of which was a cousin of Ubashi's, who plotted to replace him as Khan. When his cousin's efforts were frustrated, he turned to the idea for the flight of the whole tribe, reasoning that, as Barkman explains, quote, if the plan were to be discovered by the Russians, Ubashi would be blamed and deposed. But should their flight be successful, it would not be difficult for the cousin to wrest the leadership from his inexperienced young rival during the journey. Then, once in China, the usurper could hope for recognition from the Chinese emperor and the Dalai Lama. Unquote. To make matters worse, the Kalmyk clergy, who wanted nothing better than to bring their people nearer to the center of Lamanism, began promoting the cousin's plan. The cousin had another ally in his plans. In the Wood Pig year, says the history, which was 1775, the Chinese finally defeated the Western Mongols definitively in Zagaria, seized their lands, and massacred the people. Half of the Western Mongol population are thought to have been killed, and the rest driven into exile this time. At that fearful time, the history continues, the chief of the Western Mongols came fleeing toward the Volga, leading 10,000 households, which probably increased the number of Kalmyks living on the Volga by a quarter, a fifth or a quarter, something like that. But when the chief discovered to what extent the Kalmyks had already fallen under Russian domination, he too became an advocate for the Kalmyks' return, declaring, according to Barkman, quote, that since the extermination of the Western Mongols, Zungaria had become an empty region and could therefore be occupied. We have come from there just a little earlier, he told the Kalmyk leaders, so we know very well the pastures and the way to go. You come and follow me if you want to arrive there hale and hearty. Now in this place there's no ruler. Your ruler will become Khan. And there was yet another reason for the Kalmyks to leave Russia. When Catherine the Great ascended the Russian throne in 1762, she called for a huge levy of Kalmyk horsemen for her campaign against the Ottomans. The inexperienced Ubashi, unable to find an excuse to refuse, had agreed, leading his troops himself. Yet even after Ubashi delivered several glorious victories to Catherine, she was suspicious of his loyalty and demanded that he surrender his young son as a hostage, and had 300 youths of the best Kalmyk families taken to St. Petersburg to be brought up there as Christians under Russian surveillance. To add insult to injury, when rumors began to spread that the Kalmyks might be considering leaving Russia, the Russian general under whom Ubashi had campaigned so brilliantly jeered at him, saying, "You're merely a bear fastened to a chain, who cannot go where he will, where he is driven." Okay, I'm very close to the end time. Okay. Thus, says the history, Ubashi finally told himself that it is indeed best to go. Accordingly, he sent to Tibet for the chief lamas to name an auspicious date for the departure, and continues the history. In the 5th day of the 1st month of the Iron Rabbit year, he, together with the other nobles whom he was leading, and accompanied by their women and children and 33,000 of their subject families, driving all their cattle, prostrated themselves before the Buddha image and set out for Zulgaria, their ancient homeland. Now, I'm running a little over, so I'm going to show a few pictures quickly and go right to the end. This is the upland step through which they had to pass in Kazakhstan to get towards Zulgaria. This is just a picture of a lake caravan in the 1920s that suggests what it was like for them to move through that rather cedar and desert region. And they eventually came to Lake Bakash here, where they split into 2 groups and made their way on the other side up into the Tian Shan to safety of the Chinese border. Now, I'm going to skip over the actual flight itself, but the 170 to 200,000 people that constituted the body of moving Kalmyks at the beginning of that was reduced to about 70,000 by the time they made their way to the Chinese border. Let's see. If on their arrival the Kalmyks had harbored hopes of returning to their independent nomadic way of life, they were mistaken. Since the time almost 2 centuries earlier when Korolek had led the Kalmyks into Russia, China, like Russia, had risen in strength and influence. Now the Chinese Empire, not the Mongols, owned Zulgaria. When Ubashi and his subjects arrived there, they found themselves refugees in their own ancestral lands. At the emperor's instructions, the exhausted and starving survivors were broken into small groups and assigned to regions separate from one another. Okay, I'm ending my talk just about here. These are the beautiful foothills of the Tian Shan that they found refuge in as they made their way from the other side of Lake Bakash into the Chinese territory. They're some of the upper reaches of the Tian Shan around the Tekis. There is the kind of upland pasture that they had so prized before they moved down to the Volga, which they hoped to return to. Yeah. Okay? These are the Mongols that are still left in Kalmykia, the 70,000 households who couldn't turn, 70,000 individuals who couldn't get on the other side of it to join the flight. And these are the areas in Xinjiang, the Uyghur Autonomous Region, where the Mongols, the Kalmyks fleeing from the Volga were settled in these particular areas here. This is Outer Mongolia, of course, and Inner Mongolia there. So let me just go and read one paragraph about the very end. Sanj, is that okay? Okay, thanks. So ends the tragic story of the Kalmyk return, the last and perhaps greatest nomad migration in history. In closing, we might reflect, one would expect such a desperate act as the sudden flight of a group of people with their herds and belongings through hostile lands to be caused by nothing less than an imminent threat to their lives. But in the case of the Kalmyks, this was not so. The Kalmyks were never made to fear for their lives at the hands of the Russians. Rather, it was their way of life that the Russians threatened. And it was the Kalmyk people's passion to preserve their way of life in the end that drove them to leave Russia. The Kalmyks were nomads, till the soil, lay down roots, build a home. These were not the longings of the cosmic soul. The Kalmyk soul. cosmic longings, but of the Kalmyks. They strove rather to be near nature, their beloved animals, and the heavens above. By day and by night they guarded their herds on the unbroken steppes. And to defend and increase their herds meant necessarily to fight, and to fight meant they had to be warriors. And since warriors generally hold their honor above their lives, it was unthinkable for them to bow to alien laws and alien ways. Quote, our fathers and grandfathers had never been anybody's vassals, a Kalmyk prince once told the Russian ambassador. We live on our own and are our own masters. We are afraid of nothing but our God. Thank you. I went way over, so I probably won't be able to answer any questions.
So we'll have time for questions at the end.
Great.
Yeah, because we're gonna be, Dr. talk will be a little bit shorter, so we'll have time then.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, like,
Okay, thanks.